Um, Fran announced that she would not be in person. She'd be listening, but not with her camera on, because she is 1 week post surgery and feels like she doesn't look good enough to be on camera.
Okay.
Well, it's impressive that she's coming 1 week post surgery.
Absolutely.
Well, she was having conversations by phone in the afternoon of the surgery. So
Oh,
Wow.
very impressive.
and Brian also is oh, there he is, driving to Indiana. And I thought we weren't going to have his camera, but I guess we do.
Yeah.
We did.
Maybe we can enjoy some scenery.
So we will not see anyone on screen besides you. Is that accurate, or?
No, there's 5 or 6 of us on right now.
Yeah,
I don't see anyone else. Do I have something that I have?
you must have it set for speaker and you only see the person who's speaking.
Okay, so I don't do Zoom as much as we do WebEx.
Upper right view,
Mhm.
you probably have, there are like a quadrant of dots, and you probably have speaker checked instead of gallery.
Okay. I see arrows in the top right
Okay.
on a map.
On mine, I just have like 9 dots in a square and the word view. And when I click on that, it allows me to change from speaker to gallery view.
I have something, if I go over to the arrows, it says full screen.
Yep.
And I still just see Mr. Feinstein, which is fine. I mean,
Yeah, it could be worse.
Yeah.
so
Well, there are lots
maybe-
of smiling faces here, Jean. So
participants. So my participant list says 14. But their picture's not showing up. So that's okay.
Okay. I think it's my job to convene the meeting, and it is 9:30. You all have an agenda. I'm gonna I think move the item 2, the changes to the task force, and combine it with number 4 after the presentation by Dell and Jean. Just to set this in context, the legislature told us to have task force focus on funding, eligibility, and delivery of special education services, and include but not be limited to an examination of the provision of special education and related services, including the provision of services to students identified as gifted and talented, and services or accommodations for a student as part of a plan pursuant to Section 504 of the Rehab Act. So that's all the direction we have in terms of gifted and talented. So I will turn it over to our guest from UConn, who will tell us all about what we should be doing in the gifted and talented space.
So
Andy, may I say one word? This is Fran Rabinowitz. I co-chair with my wonderful co-chair, Andy Feinstein, and I'm so happy you're both here. I am at home recuperating from back surgery last week, so I'm keeping the camera off. I don't want to scare anybody, but I am intensely listening, and am very pleased that both of you could join us.
Thank you.
We're happy to be here. So I'll share the slides, and Jean's going to talk a little bit about what we know about Connecticut, and then I'm going to share some data about what we've seen as pitfalls around the country from our data from the National Center for Research on Gifted Education, and then talk about some possible areas of focus. Feel free to jump in at any time. We probably have more slides than we have time for. But I'll share the slides, Jean, and then you can just tell me to advance on your section, if that's all right.
Certainly.
Okay. All right. I think we're set here. So as I said, I wanted to talk about kind of the elephant in the room in gifted education, and then what pitfalls might Connecticut avoid that other states have failed to avoid. But first, we want a little background on Connecticut and gifted. And so just tell me when you want the slides advanced, Jean.
I know that Mr. Feinstein sent a document that we presentation, which has a really concise definition as well as
Jean, we're having trouble with your sound. Maybe you want to just turn your camera off, and that might help with the bandwidth for the sound. Okay, your sound's not coming through. Maybe you could call in on the number. In the meantime, why don't I just, while Jean's working on calling in on the number, why don't I just jump to my section, if that's all right, just to save all of you some time.
Very good, thank you.
So I'm going to jump out of the slides for a second. All right. So, you know, we're really fortunate here in Connecticut that we have the National Center for Research on Gifted Education, and that's the only federally funded center for gifted ed. And Joe Renzulli had it for several decades, and I've been fortunate enough to direct it for the last 2 rounds. And we've done a lot of studying of gifted education in 3 states that have a mandate to identify gifted students and also a mandate to service them. One of the reasons that we haven't included Connecticut in most of that research is that, well, in Connecticut, we have this mandate to identify, we don't have this mandate to service. And so we've just kind of been looking what's been going on and what are the problems in gifted ed. And
Dale, before you go on.
Sure.
Connecticut defines gifted and talented as different subjects. When you talk about gifted education, are you talking about both, or are you just talking about how Connecticut defines gifted?
We're talking about both. You know, we're talking about subjects. It could be leadership, it could be creativity, more generic. But that is actually part of the problem within the field of gifted ed, is that we're always looking for the gifted child, this kind of generic, the gifted child. And frankly, there are lots of different ways to be gifted and talented. And so we get in trouble if we have this idea that there's this specific child and there's going to be some test or some identification system that's going to identify that kid, and that's the gifted child. Because you'll have these kids who are really have a gift in mathematics, for example, and you'll have these kids who are early readers. And so all of those kids need adjustments to their education to really reach their full potential. And so a test that's going to find this kid who's really has this great potential to be a great mathematician is going to be very different than an identification system for a 3-year-old who happens to be reading. And so that's the big issue, because people want this nice clear-cut definition, and unfortunately it doesn't work. And so that's why we talk about the focus needs to be on what kind of services can be provided. And so I'll just go through these pitfalls and then jump to that if that works for you.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, jump in. So the first issue is, around the country, there's a failure to proportionally identify underserved populations. Underrepresented groups just are not identified at the same rates. In 3 typical states that we looked at, what you can see on this graph, and I'll blow it up for you a little bit, is that you see the line that says over, under, and the 1. Okay, that's proportional representation. And you can see that in most gifted programs, whites are somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 times as likely to be identified as gifted as you would expect. The same is true for Asian students. When we look at free and reduced lunch kids, they're somewhere between about a quarter is likely to be in gifted programs as we might expect. African Americans, somewhere between a quarter and half. Latinx, somewhere between a half and a little bit more, and English learners, somewhere between a quarter and a half. It depends on the state. So basically, we have this situation that we're seeing a lot of white and Asian kids in gifted programs, and we're not seeing very many kids from free and reduced lunch, African American, Native American Indian, Latinx, and EL students. And part of that reason is poverty, because poverty limits opportunities. And so poverty is limiting kids' opportunities to develop their talents to the point where they can be identified. So it's not that the talent isn't there. It's not that the potential isn't there. It's just that there haven't been these opportunities to manifest it. When we look at the relationship between the percentage of free and reduced lunch students in a school and the percentage of students identified as gifted, and we look at that correlation, a positive correlation would indicate that the more free and reduced lunch kids you have, the more kids get identified. It's probably not that. A negative correlation would be the more free and reduced lunch kids you have, the fewer kids get identified. It's probably that. But when we look at that across the 3 states that we spent a lot of in-depth studying, the relationship was obviously negative, but it ranged from minus 0.31 to minus 0.64, which is really high. So in some states, you tell me how many free and reduced lunch kids you have at your school, and I can tell you how many gifted kids have been identified. And that's really a travesty, okay? And part of the reason we see that is gifted services are not equally distributed across districts in most states. So when we look at the variance, the differences from school to school within a district and then from district to district in a state, that we see more differences within a district from one school to the next than we see differences as we look from one district to the next in a state. So we don't see as much difference from district to district in a state, but within any given district, from school to school, we see massive differences of the percentage of kids that are identified as gifted, the percentage who get free and reduced lunch, the reading scores, and the math scores. So schools, whether we like it or not, tend to be segregated inside districts. And so that can be problematic. Traditionally, in our field, we have 3 ways we identify gifted kids. We tend to use cognitive measures. Those would be IQ tests. Sometimes those IQ tests are nonverbal, such as the Naglieri. Sometimes they're somewhat grouping tests, Otis Lennon, the COGAT. Sometimes they're individual tests like the WISC or the Stanford Binet. But cognitive measures, originally in the field, that was the gold standard. And there tended to be this feeling that an IQ above 130 was probably gifted. There's no magic about that number. That happens to be 2 standard deviations above the mean in the world of special ed. If you were 2 standard deviations below the mean, then you were receiving special ed services for cognitive impairments. So cognitive measures one way. We know there's some issues with that. Achievement measures are another. State achievement tests. That's another way we can, identify kids. If you want to identify kids who have some needs in mathematics, look at the, the state test and the math. And if this student is, a couple of grade levels above in math, we obviously need some services for that kid. And then another way that we identify often is through teacher ratings. We have these scales. We have one that was developed here at the University of Connecticut by Joe Renzulli called we call it the Scripscus. And teachers fill out these scales on kids, and they address their motivation and their task commitment and their academic skills and their creativity and their leadership and their music and all these different areas. So those are kind of the 3 gold standards that are used. What we find in the data we're doing right now at our center is, though, there's no combination of those 3 that you're ever going to get completely address this inequity issue. That you can weight these things, you can combine them, you can use ands, you can use ors, and there's no way that you totally get equity and identification. So this is a big issue that we don't have the golden, bullet right now, or the silver bullet, I guess, to completely get equity on identification. We're spending lots of money trying to figure that out. And one of the interesting things about the teacher rating scales, and we've got a paper that we just submitted actually yesterday for publication, that teachers vary. So some teachers rate kids a lot higher on these scales. Some teachers rate kids a lot lower on these scales. And whether you get into the gifted program sometimes depends upon what teacher rated you. And so that's problematic. So if a recommendation comes out of here to use teacher ratings, it's very important that there also needs to be training for teachers in using those so that you can kind of somehow get that centered. Because without the training, teacher ratings aren't that great at identifying kids, and they overlook a lot of kids. So our first issue is that underrepresentation, and whatever the task force decides, it needs to be cognizant of that, because that is a national issue, and there's a lot of press on it about kids being overlooked, and particularly kids from underserved populations being overlooked for services.
Del, can I, on that issue, it occurs to me that those underrepresented kids are in districts that are underfunded.
That's right.
It seems to me that an explanation for the lack of identification and lack of services may well be that what scarce funds there are in those districts are being spent on other things, and there's just not the money to spend on gifted and talented education.
That's totally right. And so, in some cases in states where we've worked, because the state mandates you identify and serve, and if you don't have money to serve, then you can't find it. You decide you can't find anybody, If you don't find anybody, then you don't serve them. And so you're not breaking the law, actually. You're not going that extra mile to figure out, who are these bright kids sitting here in poverty? Hey, we don't have the money to do anything with them, so let's just not identify them. So that is one of the issues. Another issue in the field is we've had this failure to align identification, services, and outcomes. So as I said, the gold standard in the old days was this IQ. So we find this kid, and this kid has an IQ over 130. Now, there's nothing magical about that. Like I said, it just happens to be 2 standard deviations, or it's 132, depending on which test you're using. But you identify this kid, and then you provide a service for the kid. But often the service didn't match. So sometimes we've identified kids because of their creativity, and then we give them maybe some other kind of service. Or maybe we identify a kid because the kid is outstanding in mathematics, and then we do creativity training with the kid. And then we expect the outcome to be an increase in mathematics. And that's what we saw in many of these states. They would identify these kids for lots of different reasons, not provide any kind of services in advanced subjects like in advanced math or reading, and then expect that the reading score should be going up for these kids. So everything needs to align with the services. What are you going to do with this kid? Okay, so we realize that we have kids who are really outstanding in math, and we need to up the math. And so we're going to provide some services so that we can really delve into some higher level math for these kids. Okay, then it's really easy to identify those kids. It's the kids who are good in math, because the identification should tie to the services. And then the outcome, the success of that gifted program, is the increase in math. But maybe you want to do it in reading. And so the issue becomes, what are the needs that kids in our state or school have, and what services can we provide them? And then identification becomes really easy. But because it's tied to the service, it's not tied to this label, and sometimes we want to kind of anoint this kid as gifted. I mean, there are lots of little people in those schools with brilliant minds. They can process information faster. They can hold more pieces of information in their mind. They make these connections. They can make great leaps in thinking. I mean, there are these brilliant little people. There's no doubt about them. But the trick is, okay, so this brilliant person, what does this brilliant person need in school right now? I'll just keep going. So what we saw is, in many of these states we studied, like 69% of districts identified for reading and language arts, and 66% of these districts that we were studying identified for advanced math, but fewer than 10% of them had any reading or math curriculum for them. So we got this gifted program. We identify these mathematicians, and then we they didn't report they had any math to teach them because they were teaching them other things. So this alignment is really important. Figure out what services, then we identify kids that need those services, and then we can really evaluate the outcome of our program if it's successful. So I don't know if Jean, can you talk now, Jean? Can you give us for a second? Were you able to connect? No, it's still choppy. That's so weird. And you called in? Okay. Because Jean talks a little bit about this, but Jim Gallagher, who was a legend in our field, said that this misalignment of identification services and outcome measures hinders the evaluation of gifted well, this is something actually we wrote. I'm sorry, I'm not on the right slide. Anyway, the misalignment of identification services and outcome measures hinders the evaluation of gifted programs' effectiveness and ultimately undermines arguments justifying services for gifted and talented students. This situation limits the field's ability to measure the benefits of gifted services, let alone justify them. Our third issue is that we are failing to provide a therapeutic dose of service. This is what I was going to have Jean read. Jim Gallagher noted that in another profession, the physician treats a patient. The physician treating a patient will often start with the weakest treatment available and then progress to the strongest treatment once the first attempt has seen little effect. We seem to have been following that approach in educating gifted students by prescribing a minimal treatment, one might say even a non-therapeutic dose, designed hopefully to do some good without upsetting other people. As a profession, we need to come to some consensus that we need stronger treatments. The rationale for that is when we look at the kind of services really bright, advanced kids are getting around the country, pullout is the most common, and they get about 2.8 hours of it. So what kind of impact do you expect to make on a kid's life with 2.8 hours of service? And some schools are doing push-in where gifted specialists will go into the classroom. And in those cases, they tend to get 1.8 hours a week of service. And so, we're not seeing often big bumps in the effects of gifted programs, and it's because we're not giving a therapeutic dose of a treatment. As far as acceleration, about a third of schools in this country don't accelerate at all. About a third of schools do some subject acceleration, and about a little over a quarter of schools do a whole grade acceleration.
Can you define acceleration, please?
There are two kinds. Basically, there's subject-specific acceleration and whole grade acceleration. In whole grade acceleration, you might have a case where you have a child who's really precocious, fully reading, and so you might enter them into kindergarten a year earlier. That would be an example. You might have a student in third grade who really has mastered all the third grade content and is totally capable of functioning at fourth or fifth grade. And so you would take that child out of third grade and move that child to fourth grade. It's interesting because the data is very positive on the effects of acceleration, and yet people are terrified of it. And everybody seems to think it's socially harmful for the child to be accelerated. But when acceleration is done well, and I'll talk briefly about how it can be done well, kids do really well, and they report it was a wonderful option for them. In the case of a single subject acceleration, you might have this fourth grader who's doing 6th, 7th grade math. And so rather than have that student do 4th grade math, we would have them do 6th, 7th grade math, but we would keep them in 4th grade. We wouldn't accelerate them in the other subject areas, but we would accelerate them in the math. And the teacher might just have a small group of students in the class who are all accelerated and kind of have them do the higher level math. The student might be able to just go up to 6th grade and do math during math time and then come back to the 4th grade classroom for the rest. So that's one of the ways that single subject acceleration could happen.
Thank you.
So both are options. Advanced placement courses are considered acceleration. Here in Connecticut, high school kids can take college courses in their high schools. We have a lot of kids that come to UConn here and they've actually completed 1 year of college already in high school by doing these courses that they take in the high school, and they get high school credit and they get college credit for. That's a form of acceleration also. We tend to implement deficit models, and in that, what I say is sometimes we fail to recognize students' strengths when we're identifying them. And in particular, we fail to recognize students' strengths and interests when we're serving them. And so it's really important, if, when you're going to identify a kid, that you need to know what this kid's strengths are. And that's what we're about in gifted education, figuring out what kids' strengths are and providing opportunities to develop those strengths even further. But a key to developing those strengths is also paying attention to what kids are interested in, because interest is a really strong predictor of how well someone does. So I always say that we need to be talent scouts searching for points of promise. And unfortunately, sometimes in education, we're deficit detectors. So a lot of people are worried, oh, I've got this kid and he's really brilliant in math, but the reading is a little weak. And so they focus on spending all the time remediating the reading and kind of ignore this wonderful math skill. We do need to make sure that kids are well-rounded, but gifted education is all about when you have this high potential development. Nobody cares if Albert Einstein did well in shop class, and there's a cartoon, that we often use. It has Albert Einstein sitting at the principal's desk, and the principal says, well, I'm sorry, Albert, you know the rule, no pass, no play. You flunked shop, so you can't go to physics club. It seems kind of funny, but we really do need to be talent scouts searching for points of promise. Renzulli often says that sometimes in public education, we find out what kids can't do, and then we spend the year beating them over the head with it. And that's not really what we want to be about. So our issues are, I think, that we're anointing this gifted label unfairly. And the second issue is that we're failing to provide adequate services around the country. And so those are two things. So what I'm just going to give you my bias and my beliefs. So we do two things. We label kids as gifted and we develop students' talents and gifts. I think we over worry about labeling kids as gifted, and we underutilize developing students' gifts and talents. And it's the servicing of those gifts and talents that makes a difference in children's lives and the benefits that they bring to society. And so every time a task force gets created, there's always this array, how are we going to identify kids? And in Connecticut, we have rules to identify kids, but we don't have any rules about developing the services. What's the point of identifying somebody if you don't do something with it? So the state really needs to think about, okay, what kind of services do we want to be able to provide, and can we provide? And as you said about the poverty, talent development is a two-step process. We must provide opportunities for talent to surface, and then we must provide services that develop that talent. And if we don't have those opportunities for talent to service, and that's a big piece of gifted ed, then we're never going to see a lot of kids' talents. And so gifted ed is much more than just this one identified kid. Gifted education is all about trying to find different kids' talents and provide opportunities to service them. So I believe talent development, there are three legs of talent development. And any one of like any three-legged stool, if one leg is missing, it's going to fall over. So the first leg, you ask about acceleration. The first leg is, I think any policy about gifted education needs to address this idea of having the option for whole grade and subject-specific acceleration. Classrooms are very diverse places, and every school has kids who are a year or more above in grade level. A recent study that was published in 2020 by some friends of ours said when you look at the typical fifth grade classroom, that you can see about 1.2% of those kids are sixth grade level. And about 4.4% of them are operating at the seventh grade level. Another 3% are at the eighth grade level. And there are some fifth graders, 1.8% of them, that are functioning at a high school level. So only about a quarter of the fifth graders are actually at fifth grade in a given fifth grade classroom. And then we've got about a third of them who are functioning at fourth grade, unfortunately. And we got about a third of them functioning in third grade. So that's what the teacher has. And the teacher is expected to reach all these kids and teach them at their levels. And so what we say is that in this typical classroom, about 10% of the students are about 1 year advanced. Yet we see nationally that less than 1% of students are actually accelerated. So one of the simplest things with a kid that's a year advanced is simply move them up to the next grade level. I mean, it doesn't cost anymore. And they're getting instruction at their level. And we've got 100 years of research that says the effects of ability group and acceleration on students is positive. That when done well, a kid who is accelerated to the next grade, who is a superstar, like we have a second grader who's a superstar in second grade, and we accelerate that kid and put that kid in third grade, that kid continues to be a superstar in third grade and does much better than kids who weren't accelerated, who are still back in second grade, who had the same skill levels if you chose not to accelerate them. And that kid competes equally well with similar kids up in third grade. So acceleration is kind of this low-cost instructional strategy. We aren't adding any special rooms or services. We're moving students to a place where they're an outlier to a place where they match the instruction. So that's an option. As I said, it could be subject-based, moving up for just a single subject. It could be grade-based, where you move up to with some older students. Could be entering kindergarten early. I gave that example as well. We're doing a study right now here at the National Center on improving acceleration practices. And what we're doing in that study is we're helping schools universally screen students in second, third grade to see which ones might be good candidates for a single subject or whole grade acceleration. Then we're training all the teachers in second through fifth grade about acceleration and how it works and what kind of kids would be good candidates and what kind of kids aren't good candidates for it. And then we're using something called the University of Iowa's Integrated Acceleration System to hold child study teams to help schools and parents decide whether they want to accelerate those kids.
Del,
Yeah.
there's a question in the chat from Jason about the non-academic impacts of class acceleration.
They're actually not negative if it's done well. You know, there are issues like you wouldn't have twins and accelerate one and not the other. You wouldn't probably accelerate a child into a sibling's grade. So we have a really bright second grader and accelerate that into sister's third grade classroom. Both the sending and receiving teacher need to have some professional learning on acceleration, because the receiving teacher needs to understand that if we take this second grader and move this second grader up to third grade, emotionally, we still have a second grader. And there will be times that that child acts like a second grader. And so you need to understand that, because it's intellectually functioning at the third grade, but emotionally might still be at the second grade a little bit. And so some modifications need to be made as adjustments happen. But as long as everybody understands the situation, the kids adjust really well, and it's pretty successful. But as I said, part of the decision to accelerate a child is the child's social maturity and emotional maturity. Because you have a very extremely immature child, it's not a good idea then probably to accelerate. And so all those factors need to be taken into, and that's what our professional development is all about, is taking into account all those factors. But when it's done well, and when those factors are taken into account, and we look at the emotional development of this child, accelerating socially hasn't been harmful overall. We tend to think kids that would be good candidates for whole grade acceleration, and not all these kids should be accelerated, by the way. Like I said, because there are all these factors we look at, but kids who should be considered for whole grade acceleration generally should have a cognitive score above 120. And we believe they ought to have an average reading and math achievement score 2 grade levels ahead. So that would mean that a second grader if you were considering accelerating the next year, and so instead of that second grader going into third grade, that second grader would go into fourth grade. That second grader should be achieving at least average fourth grade level before we would consider making that acceleration. And that's while in second grade, and then the next year would go into fourth grade. So they're going to be above fourth grade by the time that time happens. So
Now,
yeah.
related to that, or not unrelated, is the legislature this last session changed the kindergarten start age from being 5 by December 31st to being 5 by September 1st.
Yeah.
What impact do you think that's going to have on this whole?
That's going to have an impact on some bright little kids who are ready for kindergarten, and so there should be some sort of option for some exceptions for kids to start if they are advanced, because there are some kids that are ready to go much earlier than other kids. Just being honest about it. In the past, I thought you had this option, you could kind of go or wait a year. So I think that's better to make it an option. If some kids are ready to go, that they should be allowed to start kindergarten a little earlier.
Well, the statute does provide that the parent can go to the principal and ask for an exception and demonstrate that the child is ready, but there are no standards around that at all.
Yeah, well, that exception is needed because there are kids who really do need to start school earlier. Yeah. The reason we want that cognitive score at 120 is that tells us there's this brain power going on. So when we accelerate this kid, even if this kid's academically advanced, we want this kid to continue to be a superstar and to continue to grow at a really fast rate. And so by having that good cognitive score, it means we've got the power to keep that growth happening. And so that's one of the reasons why we have that. Anyway, schools that find kids with these two characteristics, then they tend to hold a meeting and look at the situation, look at the child's emotional stability, and based on that, decide whether or not acceleration would be a good idea. If you're looking at subject-specific acceleration, the work we're doing right now, we're saying that, kids who are in the top 10% in the reading and math probably could use a higher level reading and math. They could do some advanced reading and math if you're in the top 10%. We wouldn't whole grade accelerate them, but we would accelerate their reading and math. I'll just, you hate to talk about your own kids, but then you love to talk about your own kids at the same time. We had a really freaky thing with my firstborn. That at 1.5, my firstborn started reading words. And so my firstborn, as they learned to talk, any word they learned to say, they could also read. Okay? So as the kid's talking, and the first word the kid said is daddy, it just so happened if you wrote out daddy and the kid said daddy, the kid could read daddy after that. And so by age 3, we have a totally fluent reader on our hands, okay? Great little reader. Goes off to kindergarten. We tell the kindergarten teacher, our kid can read. And naturally, our kindergarten teacher does what I would have when I was a teacher. Yeah, thank you very much, And then the babysitter, a week later, picking up our child from kindergarten, the teacher says, she can read. And we said, yeah, we know. Because the kid walked over to the Jiffy peanut butter and read the label when they were making sandwiches, That child needed something different in kindergarten for reading. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. Whether my firstborn is gifted or not really doesn't matter. But there was a need there. Advanced reading and modifications need to be made. Now my child is a junior in high school. Everyone else has learned to read. Pretty much. And this super unique thing about breaking the reading code on our own doesn't really matter anymore. And my child doesn't need any special services, does some honors classes and things, but doesn't need any special services. But back in kindergarten, first grade, my child did need those services. So it's not about, people sometimes want to anoint, there's a gifted child, because one of the characteristics of gifted kids often is that they learn to read early, but the label doesn't matter, having that gifted label. What really matters is the service. This kid needs something different for reading right now. So the kid likes school and isn't sitting there bored. Because when they're sitting there bored, that can often lead to underachievement and behavior issues, especially with boys and lots of other things. So that's why I keep talking about the services as opposed to this kind of gifted label. So I think schools ought to have in place some options to look at kids who would benefit from whole grade acceleration, and considering all the factors, some kids should have some whole grade acceleration and some kids need some specific acceleration, but that isn't enough. Kids, even if you whole grade accelerate a kid into another grade, in every classroom, we need to have this depth and complexity of instruction, that classroom instruction needs to be meaningful. And that's a big piece of gifted education, actually. And so all kids benefit from that when the teachers provide some depth with what they're teaching and they deal with the complexity. I'll tell you a story about my wife. So this is my wife, Betsy McCoach. And I earned my PhD here at the University of Connecticut, and then I went to Boise State. I was a professor at Boise State before I came back. I had met my wife, and she was interested in a PhD program, and so I had suggested she come to the University of Connecticut, because the University of Connecticut is the top program for a PhD in gifted education, thanks to the work of Joe Renzulli and Sally Reese. And so Betsy decided to apply. And I didn't know her very well at that point. We weren't dating or anything, and just acquaintances. She was a teacher in Pennsylvania. And as I got to know her, I discovered that she had read pretty much every book on gifted ed that I had had as part of my PhD program, just for fun. She had taken 4 semesters of multivariate statistics. And, I started worrying, oh, she's not going to get much out of this program. She knows most of the stuff that I had in the program, So I said to her one day, I'm a little worried that you're not going to be academically challenged in this program. And she said, Del, I don't want to be academically challenged. And I thought, you lazy little thing. And then she said something that changed my life. She says, I want to be intellectually stimulated. And I went, wow, that's what it's about. Bright kids, we're trying to provide them with academic challenge, but what we all want is intellectual stimulation. And so gifted education can be very helpful in getting classrooms to be more intellectually stimulating. And Betsy and I have talked a lot about, well, what is the relationship between academic challenge and intellectual stimulation? And we think that too little academic challenge and too little intellectual stimulation produces bored students. Too much academic challenge and too little intellectual stimulation produces turned off students. Too much academic challenge with adequate intellectual stimulation produces frustrated students. But when you have optimal academic challenge combined with intellectual stimulation, then students are in what we call flow. It's something a guy named Csikszentmihalyi came up with. And so the idea is that we need to have these intellectually stimulating classrooms, and gifted education has a lot of strategies that they can share with classroom teachers. Sandy Kaplan's done a lot of things about ways to increase the interest in the curriculum. And there are a lot of units that have been developed in gifted education that classroom teachers could be using. There's some were developed here at the University of Connecticut. M² was part of a project Kathy Gavin here in the state of Connecticut did. There's curriculum from the College of William and Mary. There's curriculum from the University of Maryland. But as Csikszentmihalyi coined the phrase, Flo said, we cannot expect our children to become truly educated until we ensure that teachers know not only how to provide information, but how to spark the joy of learning. And so the second thing on that stool is classrooms need to have some of the gifted ed strategies of creativity and critical thinking and problem solving built into the instruction there. And then the third leg for me is that there needs to be opportunities for authentic learning opportunities based on students' interest. We should never underestimate the importance of interest. We did a study here with the honor students at UConn, the freshmen, and we asked them how talented they were in all these areas on the left: music, art, math, athletics, writing, spelling, you name it, dance. And then we were looking at the Carol Dweck's mindset stuff, which I'm not going to talk about here, and the importance of ability and the importance of effort and being good at that. And just on a lark, we asked them how interested they were in these various topics. So they've rated their skill level in these topics, and they've rated how interested they are in those topics. And that last column shows where we get a statistically significant relationship. And it's every one of those areas where all of our other things we measured, we have orange only in a few spots. But kids who report they're good at something say they're interested in it. Now, we don't know if being good makes you interested or being interested makes you good, but we need to be paying attention to students' interests in schools. And it's something that's overlooked and something Joe Renzulli has really promoted here at the University of Connecticut for the entire time of his career here, because interest makes a difference. And the second thing Renzulli has promoted is that kids need opportunities to work on projects based on their interest. And those projects need to be connected to real world things. So if a kid is interested in photography, maybe and we're studying history, we can have them do a photography exhibit based on historical homes in the area. And that exhibit could be put in the public library. Now we have this real world product for an authentic audience. Kids just eat that stuff up. And so the authentic methods and products for authentic audiences. And that's what's known as the school-wide enrichment model, which we promote here at the University of Connecticut. And it's based on the enrichment triad model, this idea that you provide all kids with exposure to a wide variety of activities. And then based on those, some kids have special interests and talents, and you give them opportunities to work on that. So that's kind of my third leg, is that part of the school week, kids ought to have a chance just to kind of work on something that interests them, some sort of passion. We sometimes do that with something called enrichment clusters in some schools. We sometimes do it with what are called type 3s in this school-wide enrichment model, but that's the other. But my point is that the only way Connecticut's going to reach its potential if it helps all its children reach their potential. And I'm a gardener, and our first house had a lot of shade, and there were these plants I would try to grow, and they would limp along. My peonies, they were just terrible. These aren't peonies, by the way, but my peonies just would not do anything. They were in the shade. And about 10 years ago, we bought another home. We moved to our other home here in Mansfield. I moved those peonies, and suddenly I have sunshine, and those peonies are just flourishing. And what I discovered is that when placed in appropriate environments, all living things flourish. And that includes plants, but that also includes kids. And so if our schools can provide some of these gifted education services, if we can move some kids to where the instruction meets their learning level through some acceleration, if we can have classroom teachers add depth and complexity to their instruction and make it more intellectually stimulating, and if we can provide opportunities for bright kids who have these passion areas to further develop those and explore those passion areas, then they will flourish. And so I think gifted services need to include all three of those. Some places just do acceleration, some places just do the school-wide enrichment model, but I think we need all three of those legs to provide the services. So I guess the goal is to develop students' talents. That's what gifted education is. And so what you have to do is determine what services are needed and can be provided. And then it's really easy. We can identify who needs and will benefit from those services. But unless we know what services are needed and provided, this effort to identify gifted kids makes no sense, because you're identifying them for something because we want to develop that talent. Okay, I've talked and lectured way too much here. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Adele. I have a number of things to say, but Stephanie has a question to go for next.
I can't multitask very well, so I'm not good with the chat. I'm sorry.
Stephanie,
so
can you
just relate those?
Unmute and.
Sure. So I asked, how is this incorporated into the students who are becoming teachers at UConn right now? So you say this is all important. How are the teachers that are becoming teachers getting this? Because they're the least ones with all the tools. So, I mean, you have people who have been there and have a toolbox of some sort. I'm just wondering, as I'm a special ed teacher for 18 through 22, so this is not my skill set, but I'm just trying to think of how are we going to help those teachers? And if it's being done at UConn, how can, if not all the schools are doing it, how can we do that? Because it sounds like we need to push this agenda forward more quickly?
It's a travesty. I'm going to be honest, okay? There's so much required in the teacher ed requirements that many of them don't have room. We can't get a gifted ed course in there. So what they get is 1 week of the special ed course, because I think state law requires they are exposed to it. So they have a required special ed course, and one of us is invited to lecture for 1 week of that course on gifted ed. And that's the extent, unfortunately, that many of them get it. And so we're constantly playing catch up by doing professional development and people coming back and working on their master's or their 6th year and training them. But one of the nice things is here at UConn, we have the IBM program is integrated bachelor's master's. So they go 5 years. And in their master's year, they have the option of electives, and like right now I'm teaching Intro to Gifted Ed this fall. And I have about 20 IBMers just wanted to take that course and they're in there. So I'm going to change those 20 kids' lives anyway, and then ultimately change kids' lives out in their classroom. But yeah, I really think a full course ought to be mandated, but there isn't, in all the requirements, it's just not. It's just a slight exposure. But fortunately, because we do a pretty good job with that hour in their special ed course when they're like juniors and seniors, a lot of them come over and take the course as an elective then in their 5th year.
So
All
is
right,
this
so
just, oh, sorry, Andy, is this just specific to UConn, or do you know if other higher eds also have this component?
I don't know. I think there's Sacred Heart used to have some gifted ed. I don't know if Eastern does or not. In some states, a full course is required, but it just isn't here in the state. And so we're kind of embarrassed because everybody says, oh, wow, here you have, the top graduate program in the country. And yet we're turning out undergrad after undergrad that's not even really been exposed to it.
Fran, I see your hand raised.
Del, I
Yeah.
just want you to know you've challenged my thinking on whole grade acceleration. I was sort of with Jason on, yeah, it's okay academically, but what about all of the other social emotional development pieces? And in your saying that this is something that has to be done correctly, you're just making me rethink my stance on that. So I thank you. The other piece that I wanted to say to you is you are so right on the equity piece. And it is about resources. Yes, I agree with you on that. But it's also about a will or a vision to service those students. I was fortunate to work as a teacher and administrator in Bridgeport, and the superintendent had a vision for identifying the gifted students in our district, bringing them together and moving them forward. And that many years ago, Del. And I would say to you that I was in charge of developing that program and then overseeing it. And I have to say, in light of what you've said about the identification, we did a pretty good job. We did not use cognitive measures, but we used achievement measures and teacher scales. And we brought the students together in 2 different schools, and they were part of a heterogeneous classroom for the morning. In the afternoon, they were with their gifted teacher doing individual projects. And we also had a vision to introduce them to some things that frankly they did not know about, like museums, just experiences that some suburban children might have all the time, but they did not have. And I remember my first year when I developed it and tried to implement, I had to go out to the homes because the parents were reluctant to let go of these children. They were entering 4th grade. To go to a different school and be bused and all of that. After that, I have to say the advocacy for the program allowed the program to survive through every kind of budget cut going, because the parents themselves came out to advocate. And I'm just saying that I think it can be done in, certainly it wasn't adequate. We didn't identify everybody, but it was a real movement to move that forward. I happened to go back there 5 years ago as interim superintendent, and the gifted program was still in place. So
Good.
I do think that advocacy and that vision to identify every child is so important. And I'm going to be quiet after this next one, because I just found your presentation amazing. When you went to the kind of the intellectually stimulating instruction that needs to take place, that has really honestly been a common thread here in our task force. We're always talking about tier 1 instruction and the relationship of good, solid tier 1 instruction that engages kids, that intellectually stimulates them, and the path to special ed, whatever that be. So I just want to say thank you.
Thanks.
So,
Sounds like you were doing great things there. When I left,
Sorry.
I worked for 8 years as a gifted coordinator teacher in Montana, and then I came to get my PhD. And when I left, the parents went to the school board and said, we want to be on the committee that hires Dell's replacement. They felt that empowered and that it was that important. They wanted to make sure that they had somebody who really had a passion for developing their kids' talents.
It's important, Dell. And I think, I remember, what did I know? I was a teacher. I had just been released.
Teachers know a lot.
Yeah, I guess, but I didn't know anything about developing a program. And I was given that responsibility. Obviously, I worked with Ronzulli's from UConn. But to this day, it's one of the things I'm very proud of, because I think we gave some kids an opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise have had. And I don't blame anyone for that, because the classes were 28 kids and so on and so forth. But I always remember, I'm just going to say this, I always remember a child in my first years of teaching. His name was Paul. He was incredibly gifted in mathematics, but I couldn't meet his needs because I had so many other needs to meet. And I did not do a sufficient job of it. And I do think it is just incredibly important. So thank you.
I don't know,
Susan, you're up.
Hello. Sorry, I have to let it allow me to be seen. Hi, I'm Susan Yankee. Fran, this is for you and Dell. Fran, you mentioned museums, and I was wondering about if that was a community partnership, and how do community organizations, after school clubs, high school mentors that come down in the grades, how can they fill in the gap for schools that are unable to provide this intellectual stimulation or acceleration? How is that something that you look into at UConn?
Yeah. Jean, can you try? We can see if your sound's working yet.
Is it working at this point?
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess one of the things I first thought of, thank you for your question about the community. There are several organizations that donate time to schools for free. For example, Bushnell in Hartford will donate services to Hartford Public Schools. There are other organizations, Hartford Stage and others, that will do it the same. There's also several companies. I know that we were doing some work in Plainville. General Electric had a program where they had a service component for their employees where they had to donate time to an organization. And oftentimes they would choose to do something with schools. So they would send out some of their experts in various areas to work as like a 1-shot or perhaps a 2-shot opportunity to meet with school people. So it's a matter of checking out what's available in your community. There are lots of organizations that are willing to do that for schools. After school programs, again, they may or not be a cost process. Sometimes there are grants from various companies, whether it's a Hershey's company or some other company that provide after school programs. I know that the phone companies have had several grants where they have offered schools after school programs focusing on reading or focusing on mathematics. So it's a matter of finding out what's available in your area.
I want to say I have two takeaways from this. One is you keep on talking, you talked a lot about a strength-based model, and we in the special ed community are entirely subject to a deficit-based model. And in both areas, it seems to me that we ought to have a blend of strengths and weaknesses in programming for kids. And that's a really important takeaway. The second important takeaway I have is that Connecticut's got it just backwards, that we mandate identification and we don't require anything in terms of services. And then in fact, the focus should be on services, not on identification. And
the catch-22 is who gets those services then, and that's where the identification comes in. But yes, the focus needs to be on services. Yeah.
And the third takeaway, which I promised only two, the third takeaway is frankly that all kids need individualized education plans. That we ought to be educating, we ought to be looking at strengths and weaknesses of each kid and providing the services that child needs, not one size fits all model that we have so often in education.
Well, you are a fine educator. If you were in schools or if you were a superintendent, I'm sure that things would be very, very different. Just as Fran talked about how she feels she made an impact in Bridgeport, I think we need more thinkers, just as you have described.
We have more items on our agenda. Are there more comments, thoughts? And to Del and Jean, look, we're committed to making recommendations that are significant, but are also achievable. We've all been on way too many task forces that propose things that are of no use, that don't go anywhere. And we would invite your suggestions as to the types of legislative or administrative changes we could recommend that could make a real difference in this field.
Yeah, glad to help. Yeah.
Stephanie?
Important work.
So just by listening to everything, all I keep thinking is, because as a special ed teacher, I have a small class size. So I think smaller class size, I know it's difficult, but I think it's something that we really need to look at if you're thinking about individual education. It works in, the smaller groups. And I think with these huge, like a Bridgeport or a Waterbury, these huge class sizes you can't provide it if you have that many kids you have to take account of. So, I mean, that might be something we need to really think about as well,
And you know why small class sizes work? There's Gene, the guy from Australia or New Zealand that did the effect size study. You remember his name? Anyway, he looked at all these different education reforms and all these different ways of doing education, and he calculated how much bump do they get. And what he discovered was it's the amount of feedback a kid gets, the specific feedback a kid gets that moves the needle on achievement. And so smaller class sizes allow that to happen, because when you have this massive class size, you can't individually go up to kid. Oh, I see when you're adding these fractions, this is what you're doing wrong, and this is how you can fix it. And that's individualized. But that kind of feedback, and he found in a given day, kids maybe only get 3 or 4 seconds of it, believe it or not, but programs that are able to do that, to zoom in and figure out what this kid is doing and how to move this kid to the next level, those are the things that make the difference. And that's one of the reasons small class sizes work, because teachers are able to do that. They're able to address the specific learning need right there. John,
Thank you.
John
Thank
Hattie,
you. Thank you. Thank you. This is Fran. I've been fighting for it for years. And,
keep fighting.
28 kids in a class in second grade just makes absolutely no sense to me. And a lot of what you're talking in the three-legged stool could happen in smaller class sizes. So thank you for that.
I think the recommendation I would make is professional learning And we've done a lot of studies about professional learning across the country and how few people focus on the needs of gifted and talented students. And just by the information shared to you based on a lot of our research at the University of Connecticut, among other universities, because we've always worked with multiple universities in each of our grants, people may not know some of this information just because of the comment about acceleration. You know, people have these beliefs that they think are real, but then when you start looking at the research, you find out that that's not true. So when Mr. Feinstein mentioned about how Connecticut's backwards, you know, we've had this law since 1967 about identification. And when there was money attached to that, that was a promotion of let's do something for these students. As the money reduced to a point of zero over until the 1990s, we realized that that's going to make districts believe, well, the state doesn't believe in it, the legislature doesn't believe in it, then why do? It's an easy line item to remove from our budget. So it's really a matter of where are the priorities. So there's a lot of talent in Connecticut. And I think there's a lot of loss of talent, especially in schools where there is poverty, where students do not come to school with the same readiness levels as others. They do not have reading in books in the home. They don't have music in the home. They're not playing with math ideas or concepts. So there's a real disadvantage. You know, years ago, Jerry Tarazi talked about 2 Connecticut's. I know that did not serve people well when they heard that, but it's true in many ways that, you know, the rich schools, the rich districts, suburban districts have the opportunity to offer things that schools in the cities do not. But notice that what Fran did in her school district, you can do it. If you have someone who is really committed to an idea, they're going to push that forward. They're going to say, let's make this happen.
In terms of professional development, we'll talk about how the task force is going to be supplemented by some people from those programs. But you know, the problem which Del mentioned is there just ain't no more room in the house. You can't squeeze anything more in, and so to the extent that you all are going to make suggestions in terms of requirements on teacher preparation education, it'd be very helpful to talk about what is in the required program now that could be reduced.
Exactly. You can't keep adding.
And you know what, Jean? This is Fran again. There is a certification council that's been called together to take a look at all of the outrageous number of requirements in areas that really don't make a difference. And so I have hope for this council. Its first meeting is August 28th. And I just have hope that we will be able to look at and remove some things that aren't needed anymore, and put some things in that are very much needed. So I have hope for that.
I don't know about the other universities in Connecticut, but I know UConn made a decision many years ago to make sure that students had a major in reading or math. They had to have some background. They couldn't just go into teacher education, become a teacher, and learn the pedagogy. They had to have the content knowledge. And so their first 2 years are spent in the liberal arts program, getting that base that they need, because you know that those 2 subject areas, it does not dismiss the importance of science and social studies and other areas of the arts, but you really need that base and that wide base. We've done studies of middle school students actually in Connecticut. And what we found is that in a middle school situation, you had reading levels that were 11 different grade levels in a middle school class.
Yep.
The students, the variation, you have students who are not reading and students who are reading. How they got to that point in their school, who knows? They're just passed on. So yeah, there's a real need to make sure that the teachers that are coming through the ranks of various educational programs have a very strong background in content.
Well, just as soon as Patrice McCarthy eliminates unnecessary mandates on local districts, she can also get to work on reducing unnecessary requirements in teacher education.
Yep, we'll be right on that together, Andy.
It's a huge charge.
It is huge. It is. And people have their favorite things that they want to hold on to. Do you know what I mean? So I think we're up for a battle, but I think it's time.
Okay, can we move on to the rest of the agenda so we can get out of here by 11 o'clock?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for giving us some time to talk.
Yeah, you're
about
welcome to stay with us, and we do, your homework assignment is to produce some recommendations that for us to consider in this area.
And you will have access to the slide deck. So the slides I put in about the history, I think that, it's obviously they're very self-explanatory. And I think, what Mr. Feinstein said, we can't keep looking back, we've got to look forward. So just use this as historical. And the document that he sent earlier, I also had a link to that in my slide presentation. So.
Very good.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
great. It's great. And Connecticut's lucky to have this program here.
You're very welcome.
Extremely, extremely. Thank you.
You've all seen the revised statute. We are supposed to have something like 5 new members. There's a public institution educator preparation program representative, a private institution educator preparation program person, and then each of the chairs and ranking members of the education committee get to appoint a designee. Fran and I have been working with Chairman Curry on some names, and they've asked for letters of interest and CVs. And we also have one member who's moving out of state, Serial. And so we have that vacancy as well. It is of some interest that with less than 6 months to go before our interim report, we're finally we're still waiting for the task force to be fully staffed. And so I do think that the issues relating to teacher preparation are ones that we really best move after we have those folks from public and private universities. I also need to tell you that the auditors of public accounts are doing a review of APSEPs, and apparently, well, I got an email today from them asking if members of this task force would fill out a survey, a very open-ended survey concerning issues with private special education programs, and I told them we'd be delighted to distribute it, and so that may be forthcoming. In 2015, the auditors issued 3 reports on private special education programs, one highlighting the deficits of the Department of Education, one highlighting the deficits of local school districts in placing, and one highlighting the deficits of the private special education programs. And this is much more this is not a financial audit. This is much more a program quality audit that they're engaged in. A friend and I did meet with them, with the auditors, and I don't think they have a very clear idea where they're going at this point in time. And so your responses to their questionnaire may help guide that work. That's what I've got on that. Let me move to Patrice, and she can talk to us about what the funding work group is doing.
The funding work group decided that we needed a summer break, and we will be convening again in early September. Shortest report ever.
Very good. You don't get any points for that, though. Okay, next, moving on to Amy on the eligibility work group. You're muted.
Sorry. The eligibility work group met in July. We talked a lot about the trends in terms of eligibility, and talked about 504s, and is that possibly some of the things. We also talked about the developmental age. So we are meeting again in 2 weeks.
Okay. And who's here from the services work group? I know Alicia. Oh, hi, Karen.
Karen, it's hi, everybody. Yeah, Alicia asked me to step in for her. So we had a great meeting in July. We had 2 reps from the State Department of Ed who came. Renee talked to us about the birth to 3 transition, or the transition to pre-K, and Alicia talked with us about the transition, secondary transition. They were both really great. We do have a follow-up meeting with birth to 3 folks in September that a representative sample of our work group will be attending their meeting. And so we're developing some questions that we want to ask them. We're playing around with recommendations and identifying areas where we need more data.
In that regard, let me say a couple things. In terms of what was shocking to me is the small percentage of kids who are birth to 3 who actually immediately become special education. And the reason for that, it seems to be, is that the public school based programs for kids 4 and 5 are very part-time, or half day, and maybe 3 days a week. And so a lot of parents who have kids with needs then enroll their kids in private programs for that period to provide a more intensive level of services. And so one area that we're working with UConn Law School on is a deeper dive into the issue of universal pre-K, and whether that how that's happened in other states, what kind of cost figures are involved, whether that's the type of recommendation that we can make. And then on the other end, was a really significant legislation on transition to adulthood of students with disabilities in this last session, and that's something we've really got to come to a greater understanding of what's there and what the possibilities are in that area, all of which was discussed at the work group. Okay, that sort of concludes this agenda. Comments, questions, statements?
I'm hoping next time in September, we're in person back at CAPS. And I look forward to having everyone in person that can make it, and really delving into the beginnings. I think Andy and I have been talking of some recommendations.
And I am going to distribute to you all a fairly strong statement on this whole area, which both because it reflects my views, but also so to spur your thinking and reaction to this. As Fran says with great frequency, we spent enough time admiring the problem. Let's start trying to deal with fixing the problems.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. I really appreciated that presentation, and your subgroups. I really enjoyed the meetings too. They were really meaningful and well planned. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Meeting adjourned.